In an article titled Theodicy in a Vale of Tears, published in the Blackwell Companion to the Problem of Evil, philosopher Evan Fales posits a deductive argument against the existence of God that has some kind of interesting similarities to an argument that I've defended in the past called the problem of non-God objects. This argument brings up some pretty interesting ideas, so here we go. Presumably, if there is a best possible world, God would create it if ever he was to enter the world-creating business. We might also say that if there is a whole class of best possible worlds, and if God wanted to create a world or worlds, his moral tastes would keep him within that class of best possible worlds when making his world choice. Sure, wealthy wine connoisseurs may occasionally dip below the best wine, or even an entire class of best wines, and enjoy a selection from some middle-of-the-road wine in order to bring about some variety in their life, because unlike God, they're human and therefore subject to boredom. But God, lacking boredom and lacking anything under impeccable moral tastes for possible worlds, chooses his world or worlds from among only the best of the metaphysical cellar. With that bit of background, Fales' argument from this article reads as follows. 1. There is a best possible world, or a class of best possible worlds. 2. This world is not such a world. 3. God would create only the best possible worlds. In conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. In defense of premise 1, Fales argues that those who will want to resist the existence of a best possible world will usually appeal to the claim that because any created world or creature will be only finitely good, there will always be other possible worlds that possess more goodness, and so they argue that there cannot be a single best possible world. In other words, their argument rests on the uniqueness of God's maximal characteristics. So we're talking about omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. But here Fales makes an interesting move. He argues that these maximal characteristics are not only limited to God. Rather, he argues that God could create what he calls a perfect creature. Such a creature would be just like God in every way, but for one difference. This creature would be a created creature, whereas God is by definition uncreated. But anyway, Fales is making the claim that only worlds containing one or more of these perfect creatures can possibly belong in the class of best possible worlds. These are the modal elites of value. With that in mind, premise 2 is clearly true, given that the actual world contains no perfect creatures, and perfect creatures are necessary for inclusion into the class of best possible worlds, according to Fales. Unpacking premise 3, Fales writes, a world consisting of one or more perfect creatures is a best possible world, a world that God both could and should have created. God should have not created worlds of any lesser kind. Now, it's an interesting argument. However, there are, of course, going to be objections that pop up. But before I address them, I do want to note that Fales does discuss an objection from divine simplicity, and he ultimately rejects it. But until I hear an exposition of this kind of doctrine that isn't woefully incoherent, I'm not actually going to be wasting my time here on it. So back to the argument. It's an interesting argument, with at least initially plausible premises. But what of these godlike perfect creatures that Fales insists are possible on theism? Well, there's a number of objections here. The omnipotence objection. First, one might argue that it is impossible to have two beings that are omnipotent at the same time. One must bend to the other, right? But as Evan Fales points out, quote, this would be true if their wills were not in perfect harmony. But a perfect creature's will cannot, indeed essentially cannot diverge from the divine will. For like God, a perfect creature's will is, like God's, essentially morally perfect, and his knowledge is essentially maximal. Thus, a perfect creature will necessarily know and want the same things that God knows and wants. So another objection consists of the claim that God cannot create something that was eternal or sempiternal. But as Evan Fales points out, many theists have traditionally believed that God is responsible for the existence of abstracta, such as universals or numbers. Moreover, these beings, eternally or sempiternally, depend upon God for their existence. They exist because He wills eternally or sempiternally that they do, and sustains their existence. There is no impediment here for the existence of perfect creatures. Then Fales reaches the plenum objection. Fales states the objection in the following way. Quote, even if God can create these perfect creatures, He will also, with good reason, create other, lesser creatures and worlds in which they may abide. And so perhaps He has created perfect creatures, but has created us and our world as well, along with any number of other worthwhile worlds, a plenum of worthy worlds. So this objection attempts to make our actual world's lack of a perfect creature cohere with Fales' argument by accepting that God exists and has created a world of one or more perfect creatures, but that He has also created our world, one without any such creatures. Fales writes, what is at stake here is whether God has a sufficient reason to create other less perfect worlds in addition to His creation of one or more perfect creatures. I believe not, he writes. At most, God will add to something of infinite value something of only finite value. And furthermore, at least in the case of this world, God will have added something containing a very large amount of evil as well. Now, before I close out, I think there's one last objection that I'd like to anticipate as a response to this argument. So many people will feel that the existence of moral agents with the opportunity to make morally free choices would plausibly justify the creation of a world like ours, in addition to however many perfect creature worlds God might create. So Richard Swinburne, in his book, The Existence of God, argues that, quote, the goodness of significant free choice is, I hope, evident. We think it a good gift to our own children that they choose their own path in life for good or ill. However, I think that this runs into at least two pretty strong objections. In God and the Age of Science, Herman Philipse persuasively responds with, quote, good reasons for giving freedom to children who already exist in a specific culture are not identical to good reasons for having children in the first place. A fortiori, they are not good reasons for God to create humanly free agents. Secondly, God is often seen as having perfect freedom, rather than this kind of moral freedom that Swinburne refers to. But Morriston rightfully asks, quote, if moral freedom is such a great good in human beings, why is it not a grave defect in God that He lacks it? Agree or disagree? I want to know why. Leave your comments below. Is this a good argument? Is it an interesting argument, at least? Now, if you enjoy Real Atheology, please hit subscribe and help spread the word about the channel. Consider becoming a patron by contributing even just $1 or $2 per video. The link to do this will be in the description. And also, if you are a part of a secular or religious campus or community group and you're interested in having me speak or debate at a future event, please contact me at realatheology@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.